a Cleveland Jewish News production.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Amanda Koehn, and I'm a journalist and one of the producers of Aliza, Her Story at 10 Years, a Cleveland Jewish News podcast about Aliza Sherman's life, loss, and legacy. Today we have a bonus episode for you. I'm sitting down with the podcast's host and writers, Mike Butz and Sara Shookman. They'll be on the other side of the microphone to share with me some behind-the-scenes details of their experiences reporting Aliza's story, and we'll share some updates since we completed the podcast series last year. Mike Butz is a director of college communications and external relations at the Cleveland Institute of Art. He spent 8 years as a journalist for the Cleveland Jewish News, which produces this podcast. He earned multiple awards from the Ohio Society of Professional Journalists and the Press Club of Cleveland, including for his coverage of the Aliza Sherman case. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from The Ohio State University and a bachelor's degree in journalism from Cleveland State University. Sara Shookman is an Emmy and Murrah Award-winning television journalist, speaker, and host. She's now sharing her gift for storytelling through her own production agency, Story Glow Studio, which she launched in 2023. You'll recognize Sara from WKYC 3 News, where she spent 10 years on air in Northeast Ohio. She's received community recognition for her dedication to nonprofit causes and cancer research. Sara grew up in Akron, and she graduated from the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. On March 24th, 2024, it will be 11 years since Aliza Sherman was murdered. 11 years without her killer being brought to justice, and 11 years that her family and close friends have been working to share her legacy and trying to change the flawed social systems that could have better helped Aliza. Before we check in with Mike and Sara, if you haven't listened to the podcast series, please start listening at the beginning at cjn.org/podcast, or search Aliza, Her Story at 10 Years, wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Mike, Sara, welcome back to the studio. We're glad to have you back here.
It's so nice to see you.
It's good to be back.
Yeah, be here together.
Yeah, great. Well, to start off, we wrapped up the podcast last summer. What feedback have the two of you received from people who listen to it?
Well, I am so grateful that most of it has been really positive. People really felt like they got to know Aliza, which was probably one of our ultimate goals of this project. And they also couldn't put it down. They would listen and had to jump right into the next one because there were just so many threads left hanging. And that's how we felt, going in and reporting the story and talking about it. So it was really good to see some of the things we were feeling and experiencing and putting it together reflected in the people that got to listen.
Yeah, and we're going to replay a few clips of some of the more powerful interviews you guys recorded from past episodes a little bit later.
Yeah, and in addition to the people who maybe got to know Aliza a little bit better, there were those who got to know her at all. I had friends and colleagues who didn't know her story, and they learned it through this podcast. And from episode to episode, they were like talking to me about like what's going on, what's happening next, and so it was all, overwhelmingly positive feedback that I heard. There was people, friends, colleagues who, they seemed to be moved by it. I mean, that's something worth sharing at the end of episode 2. And spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't listened, but when Jen connects with Kenny, they were moved to tears. Or in episode 3, both parts, when we're talking about, the case and who was involved, there was a lot of frustration expressed and sort of how, people were sharing how taken aback that they were that justice hasn't been found. So there were a lot of emotions and reactions, but all in all, very good.
Yeah, I remember the part where Jennifer spoke to Kenny too. I think I teared up a little bit while we were editing that one.
I've had some people also come up and say like, you and Sara should look at this case next. So there's been people who've responded in that way too, and that's gratifying. It kind of tells us we did a good job, I think.
Yeah, and I think the most gratifying has been hearing from Jen and from others that knew Aliza well that we represented her well, that the true Aliza came through here. And I think maybe that's one of the benefits of the medium, that we got to talk to people and you got to hear from them directly talking about her, and just brought her back to life a bit, and helped people connect with her, which is what we wanted.
Yeah, definitely. So now let's go back a little bit. When did each of you first hear the name Aliza Sherman?
Well, for me, it was, I kind of remember it differently. So I remember hearing about the case. It happened on a Sunday, as we know. And, I'm tuned into the news all weekend. And as one can be when they're a journalist, you hear about stories and you start to wonder, well, is this something that affects my readership or my coverage area? And when I heard about this one, I had a gut feeling. I had a sense, even before I heard Aliza's name. But, then it was soon after that we learned the identity and learned that she was Jewish. And we started pursuing the story here in the newsroom. Of course, I wish I'd been wrong about that gut feeling, but from that point forward in the CJN newsroom, there was, managing editor Bob Jacob and former staff reporter Ed Wittenberg. They were some of the first ones in this newsroom to cover the story, and then I joined a little bit later.
And I was with WKYC at the time, and our building, Channel 3, is like 2 blocks away from Erie View Plaza. So I came in to work on Monday, the day after this had happened. I was assigned this story. Everybody was talking about it immediately. I mean, I think it was the lead of the 6 o'clock news on Sunday night, after it had happened, Sunday afternoon. And not just for us, the NBC affiliate in Cleveland, but for every station. It was certainly front page of the Plain Dealer. I mean, the business district that this happened in, even though there wasn't necessarily a lot of information in those initial moments about Aliza herself, made it a very high profile story right away. So that's when I first remember hearing her name and starting to connect to the story.
Gotcha. Tell me about what covering her case was like for you in the beginning.
So I was assigned it that day, that very next day. And I think that through the course of that day, we learned, where she had worked, at least, and a little bit about her family situation. We dug into what court records were fairly easy to find about the fact that she was getting divorced and how close she was to the divorce trial. And I went and interviewed Dr. James Goldfarb, who we talked to again for the podcast. He was the first person that I talked to, or in the course of reporting, that knew Aliza, and he knew her professionally, but it was clear from my conversations with him, in his office, that that they had a special relationship, that they were colleagues, but that he really respected her, that he understood her, that she was really warm. And it was the first things that I heard about her, but then they just kept getting repeated, right? Every person that I met or talked to about Aliza, you just heard more and more glowing reviews about the kind of person she was and the way she treated other people. And that made it hard. I think it made it harder the more you felt like you knew who this person was and the good she brought to the world.
I mentioned in episode 1 that I didn't personally start covering the case until the 6-month anniversary of Aliza's murder, when Jen, Aliza's daughter, and Aliza's brother Ed agreed to be interviewed by the CJN. So I wasn't there for some of the earliest marches, but from the time I interviewed Jen and wrote about her experience at the 6-month mark, I pretty much covered everything for the CJN until I left in fall of 2019. Every anniversary gathering at 75 Erie View, every Mother's Day gathering, every charitable effort, and every court appearance. In those early days, there was, the case was fresh, and there was this sense that something was imminent, that it'd only be a matter of days until the case was solved. I can't recall exactly when that sense passed, but the urgency around the case and reporting on it and reporting Aliza's story never faded, and it's still there today.
And what specifically about Aliza's story made you feel connected to her?
Well, for me, it was Jen. From that interview, there was a connection forged through talking to her, and it was unlike something I had experienced before. And I had talked to families of murder victims previously at another newspaper that I worked for. I mentioned this in episode 1 again, but Jen poured herself into that interview, into telling me what happened to her the night her mom was killed, and just everything she had experienced in the 6 months after that. And I felt called to share that story. And in every story I wrote after that, I tried to be as careful with it and as faithful to Aliza and to Jen and to the entire family as I could be. And like Sara mentioned, the more I got into the story, the more that sense of who Aliza was grew. And talking with Aliza's friends, Mary and Jan, it was a special sort of feeling, and everybody connected to it was very welcoming and inviting to me, which seemed like an extension of Aliza. And as a result, I couldn't help but feel connected to her.
So at the time, I was covering a lot of crime. There are unfortunately a high number of homicides in the city of Cleveland, and not everyone became a story just like Aliza's, but there had been other situations where I had worked with these detectives, where I had worked and knew to be somewhat critical of the Cleveland Police Department and their actions, the way they responded to cases like this. And the vibe was different with Aliza's case right off the bat, in part because of, I think, where it happened and the attention of the business community that was put on this case, which at the time didn't have a whole lot to do with her, right? But we also wanted to keep talking about her. And then there was just this groundswell of people that came together. And we know now, because we've talked to Jen about it, how that got organized. But from the media side of things, it just seemed like they weren't going to let this go away, and neither could we. And they weren't going to leave us with that option. The first time I met Jen, I was at Mary Feuer's house, actually. I went there to do an interview with her on camera, and her husband, her boyfriend at the time, was there. And it was just the 4 of us trying to get acquainted, trying to make them feel comfortable, which is something I hope that I do with every person that I interview. But I knew this was a sensitive situation, and Jen wasn't quite sure she was ready. But I saw so much of myself in her. We were just, 2 fairly young women trying to navigate something like this. I couldn't imagine at the time at all. But I just saw how she just wanted to do everything right, and I just wanted to help her. I wanted to do this justice in a way, that it felt like she deserved that and that Aliza deserved that. And the closer we got to the story, as we said, the number of people that would come out to these initial walks, Justice for Aliza, the various events that they held, and all you heard were anecdotes about Aliza that just really made you smile, made you think about what a caring person this was, and for her to die, and to die this way, how awful.
Yeah, there was an energy around how people talked about her, and,
yes.
and anybody who came up to it would be drawn in by it. And that means different things for different people, but we as journalists, we're in a position where we can make a difference and do something with it, and feel like we both did.
Yeah, and I think there were a lot of natural questions there, right? I mean, there still are, unfortunately, 11 years later. But there was a lot to dig into, and they were willing to help us wherever they could, her friends and family, and that was appreciated. And the investigators, too, knew that they couldn't drop this, that they had to do what they could as well.
Okay, now fast forward to 2023. Neither of you are working directly in the news business anymore. Mike, you're director of college communications and external relations at the Cleveland Institute of Art. Sara, you're still involved with storytelling through your own production agency, Storyglow Studio. This is when the Cleveland Jewish News decides to embark on this podcast series at the 10-year anniversary of Aliza's murder. Jennifer Sherman, Aliza's daughter, comes on as a co-executive producer, along with our CEO of the CJN, Kevin Adelstein. When the CJN approached you, why did you say yes to reporting this story again?
once a journalist, always a journalist.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, I certainly still consider myself a journalist. And, I had been covering this story at the 9th anniversary for WKYC. So I had just left WKYC in 2022. And so it felt very fresh to me still. It was something, and there had been a lot of movement, I'll say. BCI had fairly recently taking over the case. This isn't a story that, although it is a cold case, it isn't a story that has been cold for the last 10 years and nothing happening. So I talked with Jen and I talked with Kevin, and I understood what they wanted out of this project. And I understood how special this opportunity was because of Jennifer's involvement. That's not something that every news organization would allow for. But in this case, I think it gave us access and a lens for our storytelling that made it connect with people on a deeper level than we would have been able to accomplish without the family. And I thought, what a neat partnership. It's non-traditional. This medium, in a way, is non-traditional. And there was a way to embrace that and do something that could be special and memorable.
For me, and I think for anyone invested in Aliza's story, there's a sense of unfinished business. Her murder is still out there. And what happens in this case still matters. It matters. And if lending my voice and my reporting to this story again might make a difference, I wanted to do it. Even though I stopped covering the anniversary gatherings at 75 E-Review for the CJN, I didn't stop going to them. I still attended them because of the connection I feel to the case and to the family. It isn't as though on a story like this you can just flip a switch and stop caring after you've left a newsroom. So participating in the podcast felt like one more way I could meaningfully contribute to the cause of finding justice for Aliza. And I think Sara and I are in unique positions to help in this way. And I think we both felt like we needed to rise to the occasion, and we could rise to the occasion.
Jen doesn't leave much to choice either, right?
Yeah.
She's quite persuasive when she wants to be.
Yeah.
And I can remember the conversation with her saying, it's got to be you and Mike. It's got to be you and Mike. That's the way I want to do it.
And
here we are.
Here we are.
And the podcast focuses not just on the crime, but also who Aliza was as a person and how she made and continues to make a difference in people's lives. Why do you think it was important to focus on this underreported part of her story?
I think that we had the time, That's something that in the day-to-day of a newsroom you don't have to get into that level of detail, or you don't have the space to share it in the paper or in the 30-minute newscast. And so the fact that this could be open-ended, that we could take the time to really get to know this person, and through so many perspectives, those of her friends, family, colleagues. I think that's what really made it, I guess that's not what made it important, but that's what made this different than what we had been doing, even the two of us. When we had the opportunity and had been reporting on this case for years, we didn't necessarily get that window.
Yeah, we said it at pretty much the top of every episode. Too many people knew Aliza only as a murder victim, and not enough people knew her as a mother, a sister, a daughter, or a nurse. And so, like you said, news cycles don't always allow for that. Space on the page doesn't always allow for that. So I think it was important to do that here to set the tone for the entire podcast series. I think it's easy to become desensitized sometimes to the news. We're in it, but even people who just follow the news, it can happen. We can see things as tragedies and recognize how tragic something is, but then it might be on to the next bit of news or on to the next news cycle. And I think focusing on Aliza as a person helped make her story more personal to listeners. Everyone has a mom, and hearing how welcoming she was as a mother to her children's friends and cousins might have made her more relatable in that way. Same goes for hearing about how she grew up in Cleveland Heights and how she cared for her patients as a nurse. Anyone who's been in a hospital knows how big a difference a good nurse can make, and Aliza was the best of the best. So I think it was important that listeners got to know who Aliza was. When you do, you realize just how tragic this situation was.
So the podcast also heavily focuses on the wide-ranging and painful impacts of domestic abuse, which Aliza was a victim of. Why did you think it was important to shed light on this aspect of her story and to maybe try to help others who might be going through something similar?
Domestic abuse is something like so many people know about or know that happens, but too few people discuss. Aliza's daughter, Jen, to the extent she can, wants to make sure others don't fall victim to the same forms of abuse that Aliza suffered, because no one is talking about them. If through the podcast we can make a difference by sharing information about abusive relationships, warning signs, resources for survivors, and the Aliza Sherman Fund at Cleveland Clinic, then we need to do it. It's a public service of sorts, but also our journalistic responsibility. And if it saves even just one person, that's enough.
And in similar to sharing other details about her life that had been underreported, these are things that allowed our listeners to see themselves in her story and to care that much deeper. I think when we think about domestic abuse, a lot of people may say, oh, well, I don't know someone who has experienced that or who that has happened to. Now you do. You know Aliza Sherman. She was a successful person who had a secret that really wasn't a secret. Those who knew her close enough knew what she was going through, but she didn't wear it on her sleeve. You know, she cared a lot about her career, her children. She wasn't the person that you picture when you think domestic abuse. And the kinds of abuse that she experienced, financial abuse, some of those are things that also don't get talked about. So it was important to Jen and it was important to us to talk about those things with clarity and hopefully paint a picture for people that this may be happening more often than you realize, to people that you don't recognize as victims who need your support.
The podcast also focused on how Aliza's loved ones have kept her legacy alive, and that's both in terms of advocating for bringing someone to justice for her murder and for advancing causes that Aliza cared about or creating systemic changes that may have helped her had they been in place at the time. Why were those aspects important for both of you to focus on in the podcast?
To me, this was an extension of the work that Jen was already doing. You know, Jen had been working with the Cleveland Clinic to establish a fund in Aliza's name for that purpose. Jen herself is a nurse and had seen through her clinical career some of these things happening to other patients. And she just, you know, she could be maybe obsessed in a way about how things could be done differently. And so it was something that was really important to her. And it was important to the story. I mean, Aliza's legacy is a lot of things, but if this is something that can help someone moving forward, that certainly fit into the goals that we had for the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, earlier it talked about the tragedy surrounding Aliza's case, but it isn't all tragedy. She helped a lot of people, and the fact that her loved ones choose to honor her by continuing to try to help people speaks volumes about who Aliza was as a person. And just simply put, that's part of the story that needs to be told.
Jen has a feeling that, as we were saying about domestic abuse, people don't talk about it, right? And we did come across others as we were doing interviews that said, oh, I don't know if this is the right fit for Aliza. Those who knew Aliza well, who had some discomfort with the idea that her name be associated with violence. But that's exactly why Jen wants to tell this story and to tell it this way, because any hesitancy to go to that topic, to talk about it because no one's talking about it, made it that much more important.
Yeah, or the hesitancy can lead to another victim.
Yeah.
You know, nobody wants that. You know.
And let's listen to that clip of Jen Sherman from episode 4.
I think, her clothes were clean. She had access to food. She was very good at hiding it on the surface. Her patients would write to me and say, wow, she was the most beautiful, incredible person. She was so optimistic and had a huge smile on her face. I would have never guessed it. She didn't walk around with a black eye necessarily or bruises all over her arms, but sometimes the wounds that come from different types of abuse are not always very visible on the surface. Sometimes they run a lot deeper.
To listen to the rest, check out episode 4. What did you learn working on the podcast?
So much. So many people that we are grateful to be connected to through this work. I mean, Kenny Shepard, I had never spent as much time with him as we did through the course of reporting for the podcast. Alexandria Rudin, people that are doing this work and experiencing this stuff and the things that we were uncovering, they already knew. They'd go, oh yeah, I mean, that was sort of surprising. And I think we had just so much information at our fingertips from all these years as we pulled back out resources and went back through documentation and things like that. And you could widen out a little bit and see some of these broader themes that originally I had not associated with Aliza's story, but issues of race, issues of class, all of these things that really were woven into what happened to her and also what has happened since her death.
Let's listen to that clip of Kenny Shepard from episode 2.
There was a lot that was running through my head. I was definitely in shock. A huge fear hit me too because I'm in the middle of a major crime scene here and I wasn't expected to walk into this. So I was kind of scared of what that's going to bring. One thing that I was also feeling was like, this is my time to step up and do something that could potentially be helpful for another person, in this case was saving her life. So that was like one of the biggest things that was on my mind. There was a lot of anger about the whole situation that somebody did this to a woman on a Sunday. And after I was kind of still am upset about that. Somebody would do that to her.
Okay, and to listen to the rest, check out episode 2.
To piggyback on what Sara said, the interview with Kenny Shepard was eye-opening. I was unfamiliar with his story. He's been very out of the public eye since he came to Aliza's aid after her attack. So hearing not just his experience, but also his observations about the investigation and things of that nature brought a new perspective to this case that I hadn't understood before. And in addition, sort of like we've been talking about, just getting a deeper and better understanding of who Aliza was. Sara and I have said we both felt like we knew Aliza because of our coverage of it, but for me, that grew even more, like getting to know her favorite snacks and some of these little personal details that her friends and family shared along the way, getting a sense of what it would feel like to be in her kitchen on a Saturday or Sunday, as was described to us when neighborhood kids were over. It just kind of brought her to life in ways that I hadn't experienced previously.
Why do you think this case has been so hard to solve?
From reporting on this story for as long as I have or we have, it feels like police are one piece of key evidence away, whatever it is, from cracking this case. So it feels close, but here we are nearly 11 years later now, and in some ways it feels like we aren't much closer. A couple of things stand out from the podcast, as former Deputy Chief Ed Tamba, who led Cleveland Police's homicide unit. He said in the podcast the surveillance footage that they have of the murder and of the suspect fleeing the scene, they don't offer enough clues to identify the attacker. Tamba told us that's something unique to his 40-year career of service. And he also told us that neither Sanford Sherman nor former attorney Gregory Moore have cooperated with authorities, and that makes a big difference, at least not on his watch. And he pointed out that those are two people who might have valuable information to share, and they're apparently not sharing it.
All right, let's listen to a clip of Ed Tomba from episode 3.
Like I said, there was only a couple people that knew where she was at and what she was doing there. And I think, and they're not cooperating with us. So my deduction is if you do have a conscience or you do, know something that, you should come forth and you should be forthcoming.
To listen to the rest, check out episode 3.
I feel like we learned a lot about Sanford Sherman that I did not know previously, and I know that was part of your last question, but I think potentially whether or not he is involved in Aliza's death, he may be part of the reason that this case has been hard to solve, because he has not been willing to talk with investigators, because he is a very smart person, a person of resources who made decisions about their finances and other things that have made quite a trail that's hard to unravel, to understand what was going on just up till the day of her death, even if we don't go any further. So I think there are so many questions, and maybe that's part of it. The other thing that's hard is there's not a lot of DNA evidence to our knowledge. There is some. We know there has been DNA testing, and we know that all of this evidence, truckloads of evidence, have been handed off to BCI, who now has the case from Cleveland Police. But when we hear, I know you and I, Mike, we have talked about so many of these recent stories. Last year, all of these cold cases that were solved, and a lot of them come back to DNA. Updates to DNA sequencing or genealogically, how we can find people has become easier in recent years. And it's solved cases that are way older than Aliza's. I don't know if that will happen in this case.
We're hopeful.
Yeah. We're hopeful. I agree with you that there's that one piece and we're just waiting for it, whether it's a tip out there. I think that's where my mind goes, that someone knows something and they're not going to take it to the grave.
Well, and as we heard during our reporting, sometimes relationships change between people, and because of that, then somebody is all of a sudden willing to talk about something they previously weren't. And we're hopeful that that person's out there as well.
Was there anything you found rewarding about telling her story in podcast form?
Well, I've kind of hinted at this a little bit already, or we have, but the podcast allows us to get much more in depth in our reporting. My journalism career has been with newspapers and magazines where you're limited to the space available on the page. Those limits don't really exist on a podcast. And I think, as Sara mentioned this earlier, but I think it allowed us to bring more voices to the story. Some of the people we interviewed have been interviewed in the past by various news outlets, but maybe they were heard here in a different light. Others, like Kenny Shepard, were new voices. And talking to Kenny was a big moment. He put his faith in me and Sara as journalists, and I'm grateful he did. To learn what he's endured over the decades since he came to Aliza's aid, and to learn of the bond that formed between the two of them in that short amount of time was moving. I'm not sure we would have been able to share all of that if not for being able to do so in podcast form.
I agree with you. I think one of the things that made our relationship working together special was the idea that you have been a print journalist and I have been a television journalist. Yeah. So this was a medium that was not foreign to us, but was not our specialty for either of us. And I have been very used to doing interviews with people on camera. And I know that video is a really emotional medium, storytelling form. But sticking a big TV camera in someone's face and lights and asking them to talk about really difficult moments in their life or investigative details that they may be hesitant to share, the podcast sort of stripped a lot of that away. Yeah. The ability to be like we are now, sitting around a table with microphones, you can almost forget that they're here, right? Yeah. That doesn't happen very often during a television interview, that people forget and open up a little bit. And these were conversations that we had more than interviews. And I think that made it really special that we took the time with these people, that they got to say what had been on their hearts, like Kenny Shepard, like so many friends and family that we did talk to. We also had the ability to talk to people all over the country who are connected to Aliza because of technology, which made it really cool. And I just think the honesty, I think that's what comes through. You know, there are moments, like I think of the second episode where we're talking about March 24th, and Mike, you say like, everyone remembers that moment, right? When you received that worst news of your life. And it just gives me goosebumps even to think about it. Just the emotion that we were able to tap into, that these people, those who knew and loved Aliza, are feeling every day.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. We wrapped up the podcast last summer. Do either of you have any updates about our case or anything else that we reported on in the podcast?
So we reached out to BCI before we got together just to see if there was anything reportable. No, they say. I know from conversations with Jen that she's been in touch with their victims advocate quite a bit, and that there has been movement. I mean, things have been happening because she has gotten updates to that extent. Now, how much closer are they? Do they have that one, clue that they need that puts this whole puzzle together? I'm not sure, but it at least gives me hope that they are actively working this case.
Yeah, and they did tell us at least that the cold case unit is on the case, so that's reassuring. On a lighter note, we also reached out to ask about the Aliza Sherman Fund at Cleveland Clinic, and a clinic spokesperson told us that $150,000 has been raised. As we reported during the podcast, those funds support patients and caregivers who are victims of violence. It's used to support community awareness initiatives, as well as provide emergency support for housing, transportation, food, and other essentials like car seats and clothing, to ensure that victims of violence can be safe and comfortable when experiencing a crisis. I mean, $150,000 to that cause is fantastic news.
Yeah. It's impressive.
It is, yeah. And for everyone involved, I know Jen's involved, of course, and the folks at the clinic. It's noteworthy. I do want to say, even though BCI doesn't have an update, and Sara kind of alluded to this, but I want to mention those Gilgo Beach, the serial killer case out of Long Island, New York. This was a story that was developing in July as we were kind of wrapping up writing the last episode of the podcast. And if you're unfamiliar with the story, a suspect was arrested in connection to 3 murders that dated back to 2009 and 2010. A hair was found on burlap wrapped around one of the victims, and it was determined there was a DNA match to a suspect because of some crust that was in a pizza box that this guy had thrown away. And the reason this all came to be now was that the DNA technology back in 2009 was not what it is today, but advancements have been made, and now they're finally able to make a match. And I have to hope that that's sort of what BCI is doing, or one of the things that BCI is doing, is investigating new technologies to make the connection that thus far no one's been able to make.
Yeah, that's really great context to consider. So this is my last question. What do you hope listeners took away from the podcast?
I hope that they took away the woman that Aliza Sherman was. I mean, that really was a focus for all of us here working with CJN, and for Jennifer, to make sure that her mother's life was part of this reporting. And I think I feel we accomplished that. And I hope that that really resonates with listeners. And I also hope that maybe they understand a little bit more what investigators have been up against, what victims of domestic abuse are up against. It eye opens in a way that allows you to see perspectives that you didn't previously have access to. I think we all need a little more compassion probably in this world. And so although this is a true crime podcast, maybe this isn't where you thought you would find it. But I think we tried to thread that needle very carefully, and I hope that listeners noticed.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo what Sara said. I hope listeners gained a deeper sense of who Aliza was and what she meant to those around her. And I hope they gained an understanding of how complex this case is. More importantly, though, I hope there's maybe one or two listeners out there who heard it or maybe have yet to hear it but one day will, who realize they know something that might help investigators. And from that, I hope they come away with a sense of responsibility to do what's right for Aliza and her family.
Mike, Sara, thank you so much for coming back to the studio. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amanda.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for listening. We will continue to follow Aliza's story as updates develop. Follow along at cjn.org/Sherman and cjn.org/podcast. Aliza, Her Story at 10 Years is produced by the Cleveland Jewish News. Executive producers are Kevin S. Adelstein and Jennifer Sherman. Today's episode was produced by Deanna McKeegan, Cheryl Sadler, and me, Amanda Koehn. It was edited by Mike Butz, Sara Shookman, Deanna McKeegan, Cheryl Sadler, and me. It featured Mike Butz and Sara Shookman. Cover art design by Bella Bendo and Jessica Simon. Our theme music is Particles by Nobu. The reward for information leading to Aliza Sherman's killer stands at $100,000, the largest reward in the history of Crime Stoppers of Cuyahoga County. Anyone with information regarding Aliza Sherman's murder should contact Crime Stoppers at 216-252-7463 or 25crime.com. Callers can remain anonymous and are eligible to receive a cash reward if the information given leads to an arrest or grand jury indictment of a felony offender. To learn more or support the Aliza Sherman Fund, visit give.ccf.org/Aliza Sherman Fund. To read more about Aliza Sherman's story or to listen to other episodes in this series, visit cjn.org/podcast.